The apartment has one bedroom. 4 children share it. The building sits in the South Bronx in the 1940s, the kind of block where ambition either calcifies into resentment or gets aimed somewhere so far off that people assume you've lost your mind. The youngest of those 4 children has a name that follows him like a shadow: Ralph Lifshitz. In the schoolyard, the other kids know exactly what they can do with it. His father, Frank, paints houses for a living. His mother raises 4 children in that one-bedroom apartment. There is no money to spare. There is barely money at all. You would think a kid from a one-bedroom Bronx apartment, the son of a house painter, carrying a name that gets turned into a weapon on the playground, would stand exactly 0 chance of becoming the most influential fashion designer in American history. Right. Well, Ralph Lauren would go on to build a brand generating $5 billion a year in consumer spending before he was 60. He would ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange as the founder of the largest publicly listed clothing company in the world. He would be knighted by Queen Elizabeth II, the first American designer that honor was ever given to. So how does a broke kid from a one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, with a name he eventually had to abandon just to be taken seriously, build a company that didn't just survive for 50 years, but defined what American aspiration looks like? That is the question this video is going to answer. His parents, Frank and Frieda, had come from Pinsk, a city in what is now Belarus, just over the border from Poland, a place that had already witnessed decades of violence directed at its Ashkenazi Jewish population. They were part of the wave of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who flooded New York's outer boroughs in the years before and after the Second World War. They brought almost nothing. What they built in America, they built entirely from scratch: a house painter's wages, a rented apartment, and the stubborn conviction that their children would have more than they did. Ralph was born on October 14, 1939, the youngest of 4. The South Bronx in the 1940s was not a place that trafficked in fantasy. It was crowded, close, and relentlessly practical. The people who lived there worked. The idea that you could invent yourself into something the neighborhood had never produced, that wasn't ambition. That was considered delusion. And yet, at 12 years old, Ralph Lifshitz walked into a store and spent money he had earned from odd jobs on a 3-piece suit. Think about that for a moment. Not a toy, not a bicycle, not something practical. A 3-piece suit. He was 12 years old. The suit cost more than he could realistically afford. He bought it anyway. This was not a fashion decision. This was a declaration, made quietly, to no one in particular, about the distance he intended to put between himself and the block he was standing on. He understood something, in the way that 12-year-olds sometimes understand things they can't yet articulate, that the clothes you wore were not just clothes. They were a position you took in the world. They were a statement about the future you intended to inhabit. He didn't talk about the future the way other kids talked about it. He moved toward it. The suit was the first move. 2 blocks away in the same neighborhood, a boy named Calvin Klein was growing up in a nearly identical situation. An immigrant family, the same streets, the same sense that the borough was a starting point and not a destination. They ran in overlapping circles. They would spend the next 6 decades competing for the same industry, the same customers, and the same claim to define American fashion. But that rivalry was still a decade away. In the early 1950s, they were just 2 Bronx kids from immigrant families, each one quietly certain they were meant for something the neighborhood couldn't name. By the time Ralph was at DeWitt Clinton High School, he had already turned that early instinct into something operational. He was selling ties to his classmates. Not buying them, selling them. Handmade ties, assembled with whatever materials he could source, moved through the hallways of a public high school in the Bronx at a markup. He was 15 years old, running a small, informal retail business inside his own school. Most people treat this as a charming origin detail. It isn't. What Ralph was doing had nothing to do with the money. He was running an experiment, testing whether the aesthetic gap between what mass production offered and what he could put together by hand was something real buyers would close with real dollars. The answer was yes, they did. But there was still the problem of the name, Ralph Lifshitz. In a high school full of teenagers looking for any available target, the name was a permanent liability. At 16, he changed it. He became Ralph Lauren. The choice of Lauren is often connected to Lauren Bacall, the actress, the archetype, the woman who embodied a particular kind of cool, effortless American glamour in the same post-war decade Ralph was coming of age. Whether that connection was direct or arrived at differently, the reasoning behind it is consistent. Ralph wasn't simply picking a name that wouldn't get him mocked. He was selecting the identity he intended to grow into. He was designing the character before the wardrobe. This was not just a name change. This was Ralph Lauren's first act of brand architecture. He would spend the next 50 years building a company on exactly that principle, that the name, the world you build around a product, the story the customer steps into when they interact with the brand, carries more weight than the product itself. At 16, he understood this instinctively. He applied it to himself first. After DeWitt Clinton, he enrolled at Baruch College in Manhattan to study business. He lasted 2 years. The curriculum wasn't wrong. The pace was. Ralph was already practicing what the curriculum was designed to teach him about. The theory wasn't what he needed. He dropped out. In 1962, he entered the United States Army. He served until 1964. 2 years of service, discipline, structure, the enforced patience of an institution that has no interest in your personal timeline or your private ambitions. If you are the kind of person Ralph Lauren was becoming, the kind who carries an enormous vision and no particular patience for obstacles, 2 years in the army is not a setback. It is a calibration. It teaches you that you can endure waiting without losing the thread. You can hold the picture in your mind through circumstances that have nothing to do with it and come out the other side with the image still intact. He came out sharper, quieter about what he intended, and clearer than ever about how little time he planned to waste. The fashion industry in 1964 had a very specific set of unspoken rules about who was allowed inside it. You belonged if you had the right education, preferably a design program in Paris or London. You belonged if you had the right surname, ideally one that connoted European heritage. You belonged if you had navigated the right buying floors, apprenticed under the right names, moved through the right institutional corridors. What you did not do was show up from the South Bronx with a Baruch dropout record and an honorable discharge and expect to be taken seriously. Ralph Lauren went to work at Brooks Brothers. Brooks Brothers was not simply a clothing retailer. It was an institution, 150 years of Ivy League heritage, conservative American taste, the official outfitter of senators and bankers and the upper-middle class that moved in their circles. Ralph did not walk through those doors because he was a natural fit for the culture. He walked through them because it was the most concentrated classroom in the country for what he needed to learn. He watched from inside the machine. He observed how heritage got packaged, how quality was communicated before a customer touched anything, how the language of aspiration was embedded in fabric weight and fit and the arrangement of a window display. He was not there to climb the ladder at Brooks Brothers. He was there to understand, from the inside, the full vocabulary of the world he intended to enter on his own terms. He moved next to Rivets, a necktie manufacturer. More time on the inside, more contact with the production side, the raw materials, the margin structures, the difference between what something costs to make and what it commands at retail if the customer believes in what surrounds it. He was building a picture, piece by piece, of an industry's interior logic. But Ralph Lauren was not studying how to work within this industry. He was studying the gap, the distance between what the industry was producing and what he could see was possible. In every showroom and on every factory floor, he was cataloguing the space between the market's standard and his own. He already knew what he wanted to make. He was just learning how the machine worked before he decided to run something different. The industry's comfort with him had a limited lifespan. And then, in 1966, he saw it, the moment that would change everything. Douglas Fairbanks, Jr. Old Hollywood, the distillation of a certain kind of effortless masculine elegance, was wearing a suit Ralph had never seen on an American street. The tie was wide. Not conventionally wide, dramatically wide, European in proportion. The kind of thing that communicated luxury not through restraint, but through extravagance of gesture. The American standard at the time was a tie 2.5 inches across. Polyester blends, thin, practical, interchangeable, the kind of tie designed to be invisible. Ralph went back to Rivets and told them what he wanted to produce. 4-inch ties, opulent fabrics, wool, silk, materials that felt expensive because they were. The kind of tie that made a statement before the wearer opened his mouth. The kind of tie that communicated that the person wearing it had made a deliberate choice. His employer's response was brief and direct. The world isn't ready for Ralph Lauren. Sit with that for a moment. He is 28 years old. He has no financial safety net. He has no industry connections that weren't assembled from 2 mid-level jobs. He has a vision for a product that the person who knows the market best, his own employer, is telling him the market will reject. He quit. He went independent. In 1967, Ralph Lauren borrowed $50,000, secured a single drawer inside a shared showroom at the Empire State Building, and launched a tie collection under a name he called Polo. One drawer, the Empire State Building, $50,000 borrowed against a future that didn't yet exist, and the brand name Polo, evoking the sport of English aristocrats, played on manicured lawns by people who were, by every measurable standard, not from the South Bronx. I would argue that name was the entire thesis, stated before a single product had been sold. You did not have to come from a certain world to belong to it. You could construct the world yourself. And his old Bronx neighborhood rival understood the same thing at the same moment. In 1968, Calvin Klein launched Calvin Klein Limited, taking his own line independent. 2 kids who had grown up on the same streets in the same borough, both going independent within the same 12 months, both walking away from institutional safety, because neither one could find his own vision in the mirror the industry was offering. The difference at that particular moment was that Ralph had already sold 1,200 ties to Neiman Marcus. Think about that for a moment. His very first major retail order, before a store, before a real office, before anything beyond 1 drawer and 50,000 borrowed dollars, was 1,200 ties placed by Neiman Marcus. Not a boutique, not a consignment deal. Neiman Marcus. The world, it turned out, was ready after all. The Neiman Marcus order proved the hypothesis. Wide ties in opulent fabrics at premium prices. The market was real. Then Bloomingdale's called. Bloomingdale's was, in 1968, the department store that set the terms for American fashion retail. If you wanted to scale a brand in America, Bloomingdale's was the validation that mattered. A buyer from Bloomingdale's reaching out to your showroom was not just an opportunity. It was a signal that the industry was paying attention. They were interested. But there were conditions. Actually, 2 conditions. Bloomingdale's wanted the ties narrower, more in line with the market standard, more accessible to the broader customer they were selling to. And they wanted the label changed. Not Polo, not Ralph Lauren, Bloomingdale's, their name on the product in place of his. He was 28 years old. The company was operating from 1 drawer in a shared showroom. He had borrowed $50,000 to get here. The deal on the table from Bloomingdale's, even under their terms, would have been the kind of lifeline that rescues a company at exactly the moment it needs rescuing. He walked out. Not after a long negotiation. Not after exploring whether there was a middle position. He walked out of the meeting rather than agree to put someone else's name on what he had built. The very thing that looked like recklessness, a broke 28-year-old turning down a department store's backing. became the forge that set the entire foundation of the Polo brand. Because the only deal Ralph Lauren would accept was the one where the product remained exactly what he had decided it would be. 6 months passed. 6 months of carrying the cost of that refusal. 6 months of no Bloomingdale's revenue, the debt clock ticking, the industry watching to see if this was the last miscalculation of a kid who had gotten briefly lucky. Then Bloomingdale's called back, on his terms. The Polo label stayed. The width stayed. The brand stayed exactly as Ralph had constructed it. Bloomingdale's came back because the market had made it clear enough. Customers were asking for Polo by name, and Bloomingdale's was going to carry it or watch its competitors do so instead. Within 6 months of the deal closing on his terms, Polo had moved $500,000 in Thai sales. In 1969, Bloomingdale's opened the first in-store boutique in American retail history dedicated exclusively to a single designer. That designer was Ralph Lauren, not even close to the end of the story. In 1970, Ralph Lauren won the Coty Award for menswear, 3 years after selling ties from one drawer, 3 years after the employer who knew the market told him the world wasn't ready. The Coty Award was the highest honor the American fashion industry gave out. He had just turned 30. But there was a problem, a big one. Behind the award, behind the Bloomingdale's boutique, behind the $500,000 in Thai sales, the company was quietly falling apart. Polo was failing to ship orders on time. Products were going out wrong or not going out at all. The operational infrastructure required to turn Ralph's creative output into reliably delivered product was breaking down under the weight of demand it wasn't built to handle. The company was hemorrhaging money. A Coty Award does not stop a cash flow crisis. This is where things would take a dramatic turn. Ralph Lauren had a choice. He could try to manage the crisis gradually, reduce exposure, renegotiate with suppliers, find a way to slow the bleeding without a decisive intervention. Or he could bet everything on the conviction that the thing he had built was worth saving. He injected $150,000 into the company, his entire life savings, everything he had accumulated, every dollar he hadn't already spent on the business. No guarantee it would work, no fallback position if it didn't. This was not just a capital decision. This was Ralph Lauren declaring, in the most concrete terms available to him, that there was no version of his life that did not include this company on the other side of this crisis. And then he did something that turned out to matter just as much as the money. He recruited a business partner. Peter Strom came in and received a 10% equity stake. Strom brought the operational discipline that the company needed, the systems, the structure, the execution infrastructure that transformed design vision into delivered product at scale. They also shifted the core business model toward licensing, allowing third-party manufacturers to produce Ralph Lauren products in exchange for royalties, which generated revenue without the inventory exposure and shipping risk that had nearly collapsed the company. His greatest innovation came directly from his greatest crisis. By March 12, 1971, Polo had its first standalone retail store on Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, the first American designer ever to open a freestanding retail presence on that street. That same year, the Polo player emblem appeared for the first time, embroidered on a women's tailored shirt, 4 inches of stitched identity that would eventually become one of the most recognized symbols in global fashion. In 1972, he launched the mesh polo shirt in 17 colors. The campaign line said it plainly, every team has its color. Polo has 17. The near bankruptcy produced the structural conditions, the right partner, the right model, the right address, that made everything that followed not just possible but inevitable. What came next is the part of Ralph Lauren's story that sounds constructed if you describe it too quickly. In 1974, the production team for the Robert Redford film adaptation of The Great Gatsby reached out. They needed costumes for the full cast. Ralph Lauren dressed them. He designed a custom pink suit for Jay Gatsby himself. the suit worn in the defining scene of a film about an immigrant who reinvented himself as the embodiment of American wealth and aspiration. If you were going to select one single assignment to illustrate what the Polo brand was actually about, you could not have written it better. Fitzgerald's Gatsby and Ralph Lifshitz from the South Bronx are, at their core, the same story, and Ralph Lauren dressed the movie version of it. In 1977, Diane Keaton and Woody Allen wore Ralph Lauren throughout Annie Hall, not as background detail. The clothes were character. Annie Hall won 4 Academy Awards and became one of the most culturally influential films of its decade. The fashion conversation around it ran for years. In 1978, he launched 2 fragrances simultaneously, Lauren for women on March 12, Polo for men on March 26, 2 weeks apart. The fragrance category at that level required enormous capital investment and the kind of brand confidence that most companies spend decades working up to. Ralph Lauren invested and was confident. In 1981, the first international Polo store opened on New Bond Street in London. The specific address, the street in England, where old money had always bought its things, was not a coincidence. And then something happened that no marketing department could have engineered. In 1988, 2 shoplifter crews in Brooklyn decided that Ralph Lauren was the single most important status symbol available to them. They called themselves the Lowlifes, a merger of Polo USA from Brownsville and Ralphie's Kids from Crown Heights, founded by 2 men known as Thurston Howell III and Rack Lowe. The Lowlifes shoplifted Ralph Lauren so aggressively and wore it so deliberately that they turned Polo into the defining uniform of street culture in New York. There was no partnership, no licensing arrangement, no marketing campaign behind this. A neighborhood simply decided that what Ralph Lauren made carried more meaning than anything else available to them, more meaning than any brand that had tried to court them. By 1994, Raekwon was wearing a Ralph Lauren Snow Beach windbreaker in the Wu-Tang Clan video for Can It All Be So Simple? That specific jacket now changes hands on the resale market for several $1,000s. The New York Times critic John Caramanica later wrote that what the Lowlifes built made all subsequent collaboration between hip-hop and high fashion possible. Think about that for a moment. A kid from the South Bronx who changed his name to escape his neighborhood had built a brand so potent that Brooklyn kids were willing to get arrested to wear it. The aspiration did not flow in a single managed direction. It moved in every direction at once, through channels no brand manager had anticipated or controlled. In 1983, he expanded the company into home furnishings, not a cautious extension. Over 400 paint hues, furniture, bedding, the full architecture of a domestic life, designed the way Ralph designed everything. As a complete world the customer stepped into, not simply objects they acquired. In 1986, he took possession of the Rhinelander mansion on Madison Avenue, originally constructed in 1898, and restored it as his New York flagship. 82,000 square feet. Honduran mahogany throughout. It was not a retail store in any ordinary sense. It was an argument, made in architecture, about what the brand represented. In April 1987, surgeons removed a benign brain tumor from Ralph Lauren's brain. He took the recovery he needed. He came back. The company kept moving. The philanthropy was quiet and consistent. In 1989, he co-founded the Naomi Hyde Center for Breast Cancer Research at Georgetown University. In 1994, Fashion Target's breast cancer raised $2 million in its first year alone. In 2003, the Ralph Lauren Center for Cancer Care opened in Harlem, in the borough where his story began. In 2016, he committed $200 million to cancer care in partnership with Memorial Sloan Kettering. These were institutional commitments built to outlast any news cycle. In the 1980s, while the luxury industry was still a largely monolithic conversation, Ralph Lauren cast Tyson Beckford, a black male model, as the face of Polo, a luxury American brand in the 1980s, quietly, without announcement. Well before the industry was being asked to examine itself on questions it would eventually be forced to answer. On June 12, 1997, Ralph Lauren Corporation went public on the New York Stock Exchange. It was the largest publicly listed clothing company in the world at the moment of the IPO. Consumer spending on Ralph Lauren products that year passed $5 billion annually. But Ralph Lauren was not done, not by a long shot. By 2015, Ralph Lauren was one of the most recognizable brands on earth. It was also in serious trouble. The stock had lost 40% of its value in 2015 alone. In 2016, it fell another 20%. Annual revenue declined from $7.6 billion to $7.4 billion. Those numbers don't sound catastrophic in isolation. The cause behind them was. Over the previous 15 years, the company had signed 26 licensing agreements. Each individual deal made rational sense: extend the brand's reach, move more product, grow the revenue base. But the cumulative effect was something the individual logic hadn't accounted for. When you scatter a brand across enough distribution channels at enough different price points, you don't grow the brand, you dissolve it. Macy's alone had grown to represent 11% of total company revenue. A single mid-tier department store chain was generating more than a tenth of the entire business. The brand that had built its identity on the Rhinelander Mansion, on Rodeo Drive, on New Bond Street, on pink suits for Jay Gatsby, was propping up its numbers by being a commodity at a mass-market retailer. This was not a financial crisis. This was an identity crisis. And identity crises, for brands built the way Ralph Lauren built his, are more dangerous than financial ones. You can inject money into a cash flow problem. You cannot inject authenticity into a brand that has been spread too thin. On September 29, 2015, Ralph Lauren stepped down as CEO. Stefan Larsson, the former global president of Old Navy, was brought in to turn the numbers around. He lasted 20 months. The diagnosis behind the hire was that operational expertise would fix what brand dilution had broken. It wouldn't. You cannot optimize your way out of an identity problem. The problem wasn't efficiency. The problem was that the company had forgotten what it was for. In July 2017, Patrice Louvet came in, a veteran of Procter & Gamble, with a mandate that included one non-negotiable condition. Ralph Lauren retained final creative and brand authority over the company that carried his name. The recovery strategy was not complicated. It was a return to the principle of the Bloomingdale's meeting from 1968. The company pulled back from outlet store distribution by 40%. It reduced total inventory by 16%. It reinvested in positioning that was coherent with the world the brand had always occupied. Partnerships with Wimbledon and the US Open. Platforms that carried the language of elite sport, the Polo name, had been trading on since a single drawer in the Empire State Building. The lesson Ralph Lauren had delivered at 28 by walking out of Bloomingdale's was the same lesson the company had to relearn at institutional scale 50 years later. The brand is the thing, not the distribution footprint, not the licensing volume, not the quarterly revenue. The brand. His greatest recovery came from returning to his greatest principle. By 2024, Ralph Lauren Corporation reported $6.6 billion in annual revenues. Gross margins had expanded by 190 basis points in a single year. The company added 5 million new customers in that same 12 months. Here is a number I want you to sit with. A Ralph Lauren polo shirt costs approximately $19.27 to manufacture. It retails for $89. That is a markup of 4.6 times the cost of production. And yet the company's net profit margin runs at approximately 10.5%. Because the brand infrastructure, the flagship stores, the sporting sponsorships, the creative campaigns, the 50-year history of the world Ralph Lauren constructed. That is what consumes the spread between $19 and $89. The cotton is almost incidental. What the customer pays for at $89 is the world. The one that exists entirely inside a story Ralph Lauren began telling at 12 years old in the South Bronx with money he earned himself on a suit. Today, Ralph Lauren's net worth is approximately $12 billion. His private car collection, which includes a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO and a Bugatti Type 57 SC Atlantic, among dozens of others, is valued at more than $350 million. He owns a 17,000-acre working ranch in Colorado. He has been knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. He is the first American designer that honor has ever been extended to. But Ralph Lauren's legacy is not just about the numbers. Go back to the beginning. Go back to the one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, the house painter's youngest son. The kid named Ralph Lifshitz, who had to construct a new name just to be considered for the industry he intended to transform. The 28-year-old who walked out of the meeting at Bloomingdale's rather than allow someone else's name to be placed on what he had built. The man who would later say, simply, directly, with the authority of someone who has lived a sentence before he ever spoke it, "I don't design clothes, I design dreams." That is not a marketing tagline. It is a technical description of the actual business. Ralph Lauren did not enter the fashion industry. He entered the identity business. He understood, at 12 years old, before he had the vocabulary for it, that the distance between who you are and who you could become was crossable, and that the crossing point was a story you chose to tell, a name you selected for yourself, a suit you bought with money you earned before anyone told you it was possible. Every 4-inch tie he made from a single drawer in the Empire State Building was a proof of concept for that thesis. Every refusal, the employer who said the world wasn't ready, the Bloomingdale's buyer who wanted his name replaced with theirs, the market analysts who declared the brand had lost its relevance, every refusal was answered the same way. Not with argument, with time, with patience, with the quiet certainty that the story he was telling was the right one. The people who told Ralph Lauren, who he was eventually came back to buy from him. That is not a business lesson. It is the oldest human argument that you are not required to accept the verdict of the world as it found you, that the story of where you started is not the story of where you end, that the name you choose for yourself, the vision you refuse to compromise under pressure, the bet you make when you have nothing left but the conviction that you're right, these are not acts of stubbornness. They are the mechanism. Not bad for the son of a house painter from the South Bronx who was born Ralph Lifshitz and decided, at 16, that the world would come to know him differently.